Legendary Lessons in Rarely Told Stories of Grassroots Struggle and Change, a book review by Allen Meagher. Books about activism are rarely published in Ireland or abroad. However, the Independent Living Movement Ireland, also known as ILMI, has just published one such book, and it has immediately won international interest. As Damien English, the ILMI's CEO, says, books from the disability activist community are internationally rare. Sales to the USA were notable from the first week the book went on sale in early May. And it's an easy, enjoyable read. Conversations about activism and change, warns against activist complacency. It rails against the multi-billion euro disability industry, and it calls for Ireland to move away from the medical model of disability, which is seen as disempowering, and to replace it with the social model, which believes many of society's barriers can and should be removed. Other campaigners could learn from these disability activists. They used their time during COVID lockdowns to produce a series of podcasts that led to the publication of this fantastic publication. To quote Walsh, "From start to finish and cover to cover, it was people with disabilities who ran this project, coming up with the concept, running with it, writing, editing and funding the publication," he said. It's a neat 138 pages. It features pieces from 11 disabled activists from across Ireland, namely Des Kenny, Eileen Daly, Selina Bonney, Jackie Brown, Maureen McGovern, Peter Cairns, Anne-Marie Flanagan, Dermot Hayes, Colm Hooley, Michael McCabe and Sarah Fitzgerald, who also edited the book. She said, "The book is authentic in every aspect of its creation and is a true oral history of the disability rights movement." The ILMI's vice chair, Selina Bonney, says, "Most of the Irish disability rights movement's stories have only been shared orally, transmitted mainly from activist to activist, or they have been lost when treasured comrades have passed away." End of quote. Often, younger disabled people are unaware of what went before, of the struggle, the heroes, and the torch that is being passed on to them. Again, to quote Bonnie, "This book is part of reclaiming that hidden history about the struggle for the liberation and self-determination of disabled people in Ireland," she said. I personally liked how the story is told in 11 chapters by the very people who became radicalised, who began to look at themselves anew and wanted social change in the world around them. Upholding disability rights is now an international obligation on the state since Ireland ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People in 2018. However, there are warnings from contributors in the book that the future may not be a bed of roses for disabled people. By the way, disabled people is the term preferred by many activists than people with a disability. "I would remind people of activism fatigue," warns Des Kenny. In calling for a collective action, he says, quote, "There is a danger that in having won some rights, we are regressing from an equality perspective." He, among others, is anxious for Article 19 of the UNCRPD to be implemented in Ireland. That's the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. He says, "People don't want to be locked up in nursing homes. To achieve this," he asked, "are we prepared to crawl up the steps of the plinth of the Dáil like US campaigners did?" Well, all the contributors espouse community development principles in this book. As Maureen McGovern says, once people build themselves up, nothing can bring them down. She hated herself for years. To quote, "I didn't think I deserved to be here, but that was due to all the negative attitudes coming at me. Disabled people must build capacity with each other," she says, "and they must be employed at disabled people's organisations." End of quote. Disability activists often die younger, and one person who gets repeated mentions by authors in the book is Martin Naughton. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 62, having had a profound influence during his life on others. Bonnie recalls her first sight of him. She says, "Out of nowhere," she writes actually in the book, "out of nowhere, this man in a hat I'd never met before flew in the room in his power chair. There was this sense that the king had arrived. Even the highest-ranking politician seemed to respect him. I remember thinking, who is that? Well, it was Martin Naughton. Bonnie, who feels quietly optimistic, to quote, about the future, ended up working for Naughton, including preparing placards for protests and bringing flasks of tea down to campaigners outside the Dáil. Bonnie later led campaigns, including battling to have society recognise that people with disabilities are sexual beings and can be parents. To quote, although it's not as unusual for disabled people to become parents today, many improvements are still needed to make life easier for disabled parents, she writes. For example, she writes, baby-changing areas in public spaces are often not accessible to me and other wheelchair-using parents. End of quote. Wider society is unlikely to think about these barriers unless they are brought to people's attention. However, as Jackie Brown says, we can bring about physical changes, but getting the more hidden but really important social issues addressed can be much harder. End of quote. She also tells readers of her definition of a true disabled people's organisation, DPO for short, Disabled People's Organisation. She says, the situation, she writes in the book, let's remember we're in a book review here, quoting from a number of the 11 authors or contributors. Jackie Brown says, the situation at the moment is that we have a lot of disability organisations, especially disability service providers, that claim to represent us, but are not run or directed by us. In a true disabled people's organisation, we are not clients, we are the organisation. End of quote. Little, if anything, at all would change, as Fitzgerald adds, without teamwork. We all know, she writes, that real social change can only be brought about if we work together as a collective. County Clare's Dermot Hayes recounts his time doing just that as a shop steward fighting for women's rights in the 1970s. That activism fed into a life of campaigning for broad social change, including for disabled people. He writes, the charity model is still there. The big organisations are embedded in the charity model, and jobs and livelihoods are dependent on it. Well, we want rights, not charity. We need to build a movement of disabled people who see independent living and human rights as a way forward. The charity model is not the solution, he says. He writes again. Co-authors agree. Colm Hooley, who acquired a disability in a motorcycle accident, says, however, that disabled people have, to quote, lost ground, and again to quote, the disability industry has become stronger. He says that if disabled people do not take back control, then, to quote, we're just going to become a commodity, generating an income for an ever-growing disability industry. End of quote. On a positive note, as he points out, when I had my accident, the general people's attitude to disabled people was in the dark ages, compared to where we are now. Conversations About Activism and Change is published by Martello Publishing and is available to buy or order in all good bookshops. Recommended retail price of €12.95. You can also buy it online. Just go to the ILMI's website and you'll find a link there.